Here's an example where they give us the secant and where it's located, and they ask us for the sine, cosine, and the tangent. Let me write this in language that looks more clear. Secant of theta equals 25/7, and this says theta is between 0 and pi over 2. All right, so what do you do in these situations? When given one trig function and the quadrant it's in, because that's what they're doing. They're giving us the quadrant. This is the first quadrant, right? That's between 0 and pi over 2 on the unit circle. If you go look at a unit circle, then between 0 and pi over 2, that's in this range, that's the first quadrant. So that's what they're telling us, first quadrant. So what do you do when they give you a one trig function and the quadrant? Well, step number 1 is you draw a right triangle in that quadrant to the x-axis, not the y-axis. That's important. Okay, so let's do that. Let's start with our triangle. So, and I should have said from the origin. Draw a right triangle in that quadrant from the origin to the x-axis. Okay, so from the origin, go out, doesn't matter where, and then down to the x-axis. Has a right angle there. So you got to go to the x-axis. You can't go over here to the y-axis. That'll mess things up. It'll get you the wrong angle and the wrong answers. You got to go to this, the x-axis. Okay, so that's step 1. Step number 2. Put theta at the origin and use SOHCAHTOA. So this is the definitions of sine, cosine, and tangent. The other definitions, in addition to the normal one that sine is the y-coordinate on the unit circle and cosine is the x. That's one way of defining it. Here's the other way. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. That's what OH means. And cosine is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. And tangent is the opposite side over the adjacent. SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA. So use that definition. All right, so let's do that. So put theta at the origin. And it says secant of theta. Now, how am I going to deal with secant of theta? Well, then you got to remember, you got to have the other definitions. Let me write them down here. So again, sine theta is opposite over hypotenuse, and cosine theta is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent of theta. Now, the other ones, the other trig functions, are just combos of sine and cosine. So tangent, for example, is sine over cosine. And then the other 3 trig functions are just upside downs. They're reciprocals. So they're reciprocals. So the cosecant is 1 over the sine. It's upside down to the sine. And the secant is 1 over the cosine. It's upside down to the cosine. And then the cotangent is upside down to tangent, meaning it's cosine over sine. Okay, so what? Well, up here they told me secant. So what's secant? 1 over the cosine. And what's the cosine right here? So it's upside down of cosine, so it must be hypotenuse over adjacent. See how that's upside down of adjacent over hypotenuse? Is hypotenuse over adjacent? That's what this means, 1 over cosine, upside down of cosine. So secant must be hypotenuse over adjacent. Hypotenuse over adjacent. So let's use that, hypotenuse over adjacent. So this is hypotenuse over adjacent. So the hypotenuse must be 25. Oh, by the way, what are these signs? Let's make sure this is clear here. This is the opposite side, right? This is the side across from theta. This is opposite. This side's the hypotenuse because it's the side across from the right angle. And therefore, this must be the adjacent side. Adjacent just means next to it. This is the side right next to theta. See, it's touching theta. It's right next to it. Adjacent, like your neighbor lives adjacent to you, next to you. All right, so with that in mind, the hypotenuse is 25. So the hypotenuse must be 25. The adjacent is 7. This must be 7. So then we got to find this other side. Call it B, call it X, call it whatever you want. How do we find it? Step 3. Use the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, to find the missing side. So I'm going to do that. So a squared plus b squared is c squared. So that's, now which one's the c? The hypotenuse has to be the c, because that's the longest side. So when you write the Pythagorean, the c is always the hypotenuse. So 7 squared plus b squared is 25 squared, so that's 49, plus b squared is 625. Subtract 49 from both sides, and we get b squared equals, what's that going to be, 576, I'm thinking? Yeah, and then we root both sides. And that's 24. B is a nice clean 24. So bring that back up here. B equals 24. Now put in the correct signs for A and B. Meaning, what do you mean correct signs? Meaning, remember, this is a coordinate system. So this is positive x, positive y if you go up, negative y if you go down, right? So to get to this point, we go right and up. That's positive, positive. Positive 7, positive 20. This is the point over 7 up 24. It's his coordinates. Right 7 up 24. They're both positive. Everything's positive in the first quadrant. So there we go. So now we can answer the questions. So here we go. What's the sine of theta? Well, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So opposite over hypotenuse. What's the opposite? 20. Oh, whoop, that's not the opposite. That's the hypotenuse. Opposite 24 over 25, right? 24 over 25. So there's the first answer. Let's try the next one. What's the cosine? Oops. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. What's the adjacent? 7 over the hypotenuse of 25. So there we go. Last, tangent. What's tangent? Now tangent, right here, is opposite over adjacent. So it's opposite. Let me write that first. Opposite over adjacent. So opposite, 24 over adjacent, 7. And there it is. So that's how we find those. So it all came from drawing the right triangle in the first quadrant and putting the fact that secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. We got that because secant is the upside down to cosine. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. We put that in the right triangle, did the Pythagorean theorem, found B, and then we could answer the questions. There we go.